Today I listened to an audiobook of a ghost story by Charles Dickens called The Signalman. And the protagonist, the main character of the story, encounters a signalman on this haunting sort of eerie railroad track. You know, almost has this kind of cavernous sort of ghostly feeling about it, and the signalman and his crew are constantly visited by an apparition, a ghost who always pretends something tragic and violent that will happen on the railway. Usually a death, always a death. And the protagonist firsthand actually experiences some of these tragedies. The first is a young woman dying on the railroad, and then the third tragedy, the last one of the entire story, is the signalman dying. And each time the apparition arrives, there's a strange vibration that appears, and the bell rings 3 times. I was astounded. I mean, it's great writing. I've really been getting more into Charles Dickens recently. He's been a big help to me, of course, in a creative sense, and I think also it indicates to me what has been missing in horror these days, which is, I think that horror tends to lack eccentricity, which is why it's not as frightening anymore. It tends to appeal a little bit too much to, like, especially in the Stephen King movies, or the books, or this kind of slasher and macabre nature that you see in movies like It, or movie Carrie, or whatever. It appeals a little bit too much to the moral sensibilities that people have, like revulsion, disgust, shock. It's a little bit too controlled by morality, and it's not controlled enough by that sense of the uncanny, right? That sense that it's like a feeling that you may not even always necessarily be able to put your finger on what exactly it is, because it may not always be a purely bad or negative emotion, and I've touched on this a little bit before in the past, right? It's kind of like a feeling of what you'd imagine a sixth sense being. Like, even that movie, The Sixth Sense, illustrates that perfectly, right? And that I think that kind of horror is just to make you feel like that must exist. Like, in the same way that people have had that experience of, when they have a crush on, they fall in love with somebody, and that person kind of reflects something about themselves, or something that they see in themselves, or whatever. It's like when you see that kind of horror, it sort of reflects something that feels almost, in a sense, kind of familiar, a sense of feeling personal, as if that sort of sixth sense is something that is collectively shared and experienced by everybody, right? And so it sort of veers away just from the more animal emotions, or the moral emotions, right? And I think this is something for me to keep in mind too, right? Is that there should be, and I try to balance those two things out all the time, right? And then even when I do add in the animal emotions, the revulsion, the horror, right, I always like to show there's some amount of discernment, like a sense that there's an informed opinion, that it's directing, the attention is being directed at sort of important issues that are intended to provide constructive criticism. And I think that's what's important in dark satire and all kinds of genres, really, but I think maybe perhaps the reason why some of the things have degenerated, have gone downhill, is because I think that the art went through a certain turning point, where it became a little bit more meaningless or more chaotic, perhaps because of the sort of avant-garde movements that I've talked about before. Right, and then the debris that's sort of left over from that tends to be these sort of recycled cliches, sometimes an actual banality. Like, banality is sort of like the aftershock of that sort of really chaotic movement that kind of destroyed everything, and then people only have these bits and fragments and pieces to kind of pick up after that, But as I was saying about the story American Psycho, about that sort of hotshot psychopath CEO that with all these violent commits all these violent crimes, right, is that he really does depict that side of human beings, that the more animal, the more violent nature in human beings. But the writer doesn't seem to be doing it gratuitously, right? He said he's bringing back the more traditional and more that sense of order that you see in traditional storytelling, right? That unifies things, that gives things meaning and structure. And so I also think that that's important. That's definitely also what you see in the story of the Signalman.